This is a situation that has been developing in a very worrying way for quite a number of years now. And some of us have personally been following it very closely and have tried to do what we can to be helpful. Many of our countries have been attentive to the problem. And as Liberal International and ALDE and ELDR and other groupings like ALDE PAC, which very much comes out of the ALDE group in the Parliament.
So the situation is, by any account, very, very grave. Factor in that you have huge shortages of food across the country, more so in the rural areas, and those food shortages affect not just those people who are poor and have no money, but now have begun to also affect those who actually have money to buy.
How do you turn around a country that has sunk so far and so fast? A country where the average life expectancy for a woman is now just 34 years. It cannot be done without political change. And I think the question to the panel is, since we as Liberals are committed to freedom and democracy, what is our role in helping to bring about that political change? Does change have to come from within, as John Stuart Mill believed? And if so, does the victory of the MDC at the ballot box and against the odds count as a homegrown stimulus for change? However much we yearn for democratic, fair government in Zimbabwe, we should never underestimate its president.
Can Zimbabwe and Africa engender democratic transformation, economic revival, and social renewal? Is African Renaissance a receding mirage or an imminent reality? The answers to these questions depend on the ability of the Zimbabwean and other African peoples to overcome the general malaise afflicting them, take their destiny into their own hands, and reverse the trajectory of Africa's development.
When you talk of MDC, my heart bleeds. When you talk of ZANU-PF, the atrocities they perpetrate on others, my heart still bleeds, even for themselves. You have families torn apart because of one person, Jonge. We call him Jonge in our village. I don't know what you call him, Jonge. He is quite old, and I think and doubt if old age has something to do with wisdom.
The common discussion in Europe and elsewhere, both inside and outside of this house, is very much on the role of immigrants in the communities that are hosting them. We don't usually debate on the other side of the coin the contribution that can be made to the countries that they come from. So what we'll look at today is what the African diaspora, and in particular the Zimbabwean diaspora, can contribute or not to Zimbabwe and the democratic development there.
It has been suggested that 1 in 4 Zimbabweans live outside of Zimbabwe. What I am quite clear about is that many of those, and almost all of those Zimbabweans who live outside of Zimbabwe are very actively engaged in Zimbabwe somehow, in the sense that many of them left and have left as part of a family unit. They're living outside of Zimbabwe, trying to eke a living where they are and sending money back home. So for most of us in Zimbabwe, the experience of being outside of the country is really about supporting people back home with money.
The Zimbabwean diaspora, because of the stresses of living outside, it's not a simple question of the diaspora is going to return overnight and contribute enormously in a very short space of time to Zimbabwe's reconstruction. I think people do want to help. People are trying to help, but what's basically has happened, I think, in terms of people in the diaspora, in March this year, I think, I think people in the diaspora felt there was a sort of democratic surge after the elections, and I know a lot of people who are living outside of Zimbabwe, for a a very brief period for a week or a couple of weeks, we're saying we're going home. By the end of this year, we'll be home in Zimbabwe. We're going to rebuild Zimbabwe and so on and so forth. Of course, the political situation changed. You know, the hopes that had been engendered from the March elections were swiftly quashed by June, and we have the situation now.
The majority of these Zimbabweans resident outside the country are not active participants in the struggle against the dictatorship in Zimbabwe. And so, whilst I concede to the views of my colleagues who are also resident outside the country about engagement, it is important to understand the facts of the issues over the last 10 years we've been fighting Robert Mugabe.
In the polling stations where ZANU-PF expected to win or had traditionally won, and the results came out in favor of the opposition, it was teachers who were dragged into the streets and made human examples of in terms of being intimidated and beaten. And so we have also, in our own efforts with the partners that I described before, attempted to mobilize funds in their defense, working with the Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights.
You were somewhat provocative with regard to Europe, admittedly, but maybe you were right. At times I did rather get the impression you were pleading for a Savimbi-type solution, but then you actually clarified things and reassured us somewhat, I must say. Anyway, be this as it may, besides our responsibilities as a European Union, there are, of course, the responsibilities of the African leaders, and I must confess that there was somebody who took their responsibilities vis-à-vis this crisis in Zimbabwe, and that was certainly President Wade of Senegal, who was extremely clear about this, extremely clear.
We have here a continent which is clearly endowed with so much wealth, but yet the people of Africa are among the poorest people on earth. The question is really, why is that the case? Is it because people are not clever enough to build viable societies?
I call the crisis in South Africa, I lay it at the door of African leadership. A total and utter failure on the part of African leadership, from the AU to SADC to individual leaders, particularly to the President of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki.
I have grown convinced over the years that no lasting solution for any African country is possible without the local population taking ownership of the situation in that country. And that is not because we don't want to get involved, but because generally to really improve upon a situation, you need to follow it up on a more or less permanent basis. You can't do it by simply stop and go.